with storytelling. Storytelling has become very popular at the moment. Everyone's talking about storytelling. I've actually been teaching business people how to share stories more effectively for over 15 years now. So I left my corporate job with one of Australia's largest banks 15 years ago when I realised that the really great leaders were sharing stories and the really great presenters would also share stories. So 15 years ago, I embarked on running my own business, teaching people how to do that. And I've had a whole lot of follow the concept of storytelling. You need to skill people how to do it properly. There's a really big difference between sharing stories, with our friends and family and sharing stories in a work context. So this is where we start the skilling process. Part of that skilling, understand the power of storytelling, you start to capture stories. So whether they're your own personal stories or whether they're work-related stories, your clients or customers or worked on, you start to capture those stories and share them, sharing them on all the normal communication mediums. So face, at presentations, on webinars, videos, in blog posts, in newsletters, all the normal communication channels you do. Your personal brand is literally about the stories people tell about you when you're not in. So it's what I call the grapevine. Everyone's part of the grapevine, and you can't control the grapevine, but you can certainly influence it by the stories you proactively share and put into the grapevine, and the things you do that generate stories. So actions and behaviors will generate stories. So there are starts. So next, how together is giving you, I guess, some tips and techniques over the last 15 years that I know work, that I know work within storytelling in business. And this is all about how we communicate more effectively through stories in a business format, in a professional format. So as humans, we are hardwired to tell stories. It's the way we communicate. It's actually how we naturally communicate all the time. And I've got no doubt that you probably already share stories in business, but you're going to have a certain style. And your style is determined by two things. And the first is how purposeful you are with your stories. So when you're sharing your story, are you really clear on what the purpose of the story is, why you're sharing the story? Are you really clear on the message you want to communicate through the story, or the outcome you want to achieve? Now, what I find is a lot of people either aren't really clear on their message, they actually don't know why they're sharing their story, or sometimes they go, yep, I'm really clear, I want them to understand A, B, C, and D. If that's the case, that's 4 messages, so you need 4 stories. So the first tip is always try to have one single message per story, because the moment we try to put too many messages into our story, it will just lose its impact. The other thing that determines your style is your engagement level, so how engaging your stories are. So when you're sharing your story, are people fully engaged with you the entire time, or have they sort of stopped listening well before you've stopped talking? So your engagement level. Now, this is a judgmental model, so where we don't want to be is the bragger. Now, the bragger tends to tell a lot of stories about themselves, how good they are. There tends to be no real reason for them sharing the story except for them to tell you how great they are. Now, I'm not suggesting that you don't want to share stories about the good things you've done. You absolutely do, but you don't want them to have that bragger feel. So to avoid having that bragger feel, share stories of mistakes you've made, or even if it's stories of good things you've done, bring in vulnerability, bring in humility. Even some self-deprecating humor can drag it out of that bragger space. The other style we see is the joker. So the joker tells really entertaining stories, love the joker stories, but the joker misses out on this amazing business opportunity because they actually don't attach a key message to their story. So people remember the story because it's really funny and engaging, but there's no message to it. So, they miss out on an opportunity. And then we see the reporter. So the reporter is really clear on the story they want to share. They know why they're sharing the story. They're clear on the message they want to get across, the outcome they want to get. But the reporter tends to use only work-related stories. Now, there's nothing wrong with work-related stories, but that is the default of the reporter, and that is where they stay. The reporter also tends to bring a lot of facts and figures and statistics into their story. And the moment you do that, you actually start to lose engagement level with too much data and numbers and facts. And the reporter believes that a case study is a story. A case study is not a story. There's nothing wrong with case studies. They provide really valuable information, but they're not stories. I run a business on storytelling, and I absolutely use case studies, but I know that they're not stories. So, and as we work through what makes a story, that might become a little bit clearer. And then finally, we have the inspirer. So the inspirer is really clear on why they're sharing the story. They know the message they want to get across, but the inspirer tends to use personal stories to communicate their business message. And when I'm talking about personal stories, they don't have to be, really deep, dark secrets you have. And they also don't have to be the most amazing, inspiring stories. This isn't about climbing Mount Everest type stories, but they're your day-to-day stories. So what I mean by an inspirer is that your stories inspire action. So when you share a story, do people do something different as a result of that? Do they feel something different as a result of hearing your story, or do they think something different? So do they do, feel, or think something different? So are you inspiring action when people hear your story? Now, the vast majority of us, as you're looking at this model, if you're perhaps thinking, where you are on the model, I would sort of pose the question to you, where do you think the vast majority of us are? And if you've answered reporter, you'd be correct. Every country I've worked in, every company I've worked in, and every industry I've worked in, the vast majority of us are reporters. And we're reporters for a very good reason. First of all, it feels very safe to be a reporter. You don't have to give anything of yourself. You don't have to reveal anything about yourself. So it feels a lot safer. We also think there's safety in just giving facts and figures, and if we're just reporting the information, people really can't go against that. But we sort of know that's not true as well. And I think typically why we're reporters is because all our career we've been told that that's the way you communicate in business. We've probably been told work's works, personal, don't mix the two. We see this in our day-to-day life. We see people more senior than us just having this reporter style, but we know that it's not very engaging. Now, sometimes all you do need to do is report facts, but when you're trying to inspire people into action, when you're trying to actually get them to do something different or feel something different or think something different, just reporting on the facts won't do that. So let me provide an example of what I mean by an inspirer story. I think it highlights really well what an inspirer story is. So I did some work with a company, and I ran a workshop for the entire risk team. Now, the head of risk, her name was Rosemary. And she said that the biggest issue she had was when she was trying to communicate the role of a risk manager to all the business units she supported, they just wouldn't get the message. They assumed that the role of a managing risk was her job because she was the risk manager. And it didn't matter how many times she would tell them that she cannot manage their risk for them. All she can do is help them manage their risk. The message wasn't getting through. She was providing case study after case study, example after example of the benefits of managing your own risk, the consequences of not, but the message wasn't getting through. So this is the story Rosemary started to share. She said, when I was a kid, I grew up on a farm. And growing up on a farm, there was all these dangers we needed to be aware of, but Mum would teach us what to do. So we knew what to do if we came across a snake in summer. We knew what to do if we ever came across a spider in the timber heap, and we knew how to avoid all the traps in the dam after heavy rain. And this really, really hot day, Mum was yelling at me to get my bike from the front gate. So I ran down the path and then I just froze because in front of my bike was this massive copperhead snake. But I remembered everything Mum taught us to do. So I played statues and I slowly walked backwards until there was enough space between me and the snake, and I ran back to the house to tell Mum. And I'm sharing this with you because it reminds me of the role we play in risk. All I can do is give you the skills, knowledge, and advice. So when you come across your own copperhead snake, regardless of what that looks like, you will know what to do. Now, I want to pose a question to you. After hearing that story, does that help you understand the role of a risk manager better? Are you sort of sitting there going, yeah, I sort of understand now the role the risk manager plays? Would you remember that story? So, in a day's time, in a week's time, do you think you would actually remember that story? And would you be able to retell that story to someone else without losing its meaning? Now, you wouldn't have to do it word for word. I don't expect that. But could you retell it without losing its meaning? And I would suggest that the answer to those three questions are yes, that it does help you understand the role of a risk manager better. You will remember it, and you'll be able to use it to explain the message to someone else. They are, I think, some of our fundamental challenges in business, whether we're communicating to our teams, whether we're communicating to clients, whether we're communicating to the board or to other stakeholders. The real challenge in communication is, do people really understand what you're saying? Really understand it? Can they remember it when the meeting's over, the presentation's finished? Can they actually remember it? And can they retell it to other people without losing its meaning? And a story, your personal story, can give you traction on those three things. When I was sharing the story also, did you visualize? Could you visualize the girl? Could you visualize her running to get the bike? Could you visualize the snake? Now, you might have no idea what a copperhead snake looks like. So you're probably imagining some other snake, like a cobra or something, but you would have all visualized it, and you've visualized something different. And that's because at some level that's tapped into emotion. And the brain actually processes emotion differently to just logic and data. First of all, it processes it quicker. So we make emotional decisions really, really quickly, and then we justify them on logic. And also emotion is stored in the long-term part of our brain. So that is why, we will remember that story, because at some level that is tapped into emotion. And this is why sometimes there's things that happen in our life that we have a really strong emotional connection with, that we remember exactly where we were and what we were doing. For example, I'm sure a lot of you will remember exactly where you were and what you were doing when you heard about 9/11. So those moments that have a really strong emotional impact, we even know exactly where we were. So that's the power of when something taps into emotion, how it can be stored in the long-term part of our brain. One of the things people often ask me about is what makes a story an actual story, because there's a lot of talk about story. I see a lot of people using the word story, but not actually telling a story. Or have you noticed that there's a bit of a trend on websites at the moment where they talk about, instead of about us, it's changed to our story. I can't help myself. I get in and look, and 9 times out of 10, it's not a story. So just calling something a story doesn't make it a story. So I thought one of the really beneficial things I could do for you with the time we have together is to help you be really clear on what actually makes a story a story. And so the first thing here that you can see on the screen is it's got to have a sequence. So you need to have a sequence in your story. Now, I know this may seem really obvious, but the sequence we stick with is beginning, middle, and end. So that has stood the test of time. It was actually Aristotle, the Greek philosopher Aristotle, 2,500 years ago, that said for a story to be a story, it needs to have a beginning, middle, and end. We all know people that tell stories without an ending. Don't be that person. Don't be that person that shares a story without an ending. And there's a real skill and understanding with how you do actually start your stories and what you put in the middle and what you put at the end. The other thing that makes a story, it needs to have a specific event. So too often in business, we talk in generalities. We talk at this really high level, level where we don't go into detail. Give me a specific event. Give me an example of something that's happened. Don't just talk about innovation or diversity or innovation. Give me an example of that happening. So for those of you wondering why there's a snake on the screen, this is a copperhead snake. So this is what a copperhead snake looks like. So if Rosemary had shared her story without the copperhead snake, so for example, if she had said, when I was a kid, I grew up on a farm, and growing up on a farm, there was all these dangers we needed to be aware of, but Mum would teach us what to do. And I'm sharing this with you because it reminds me of the role we play in risk. All I can do is give you the skills, knowledge, and advice to help you deal with your own copperhead snakes, regardless of what that looks like. If Rosemary had have shared just that without the copperhead snake, it wouldn't be a story, because it was only when she talked about the copperhead snake did you visualize something. So as I said, could you visualize it? So you've actually visualized the snake and you've felt something. So at some level that has tapped into emotion. Without the specific event, you don't get, you can't visualize something and you don't feel something. And I often say that the fastest way to the brain is through the heart. So often in business, what we do is we think we're trying to communicate something really logical, that we think we need to communicate it in a really logical way. If you've ever had that feeling of why can't I get it through their head, it's because you're probably trying to get it through their head. But if you went via their heart and if you tapped into emotion, that is the fastest path to the head. So the fastest path to the head is through the heart, and a story can do that. So that's what makes a story at a bare minimum level. It needs to have a beginning, middle, and end. It needs to have a specific event so the audience feels something and visualize something. Now, there's some other considerations when we're talking about stories in business. So when we're talking about stories in business, there's a whole lot of other things we need to be mindful of, because there is a very big difference between sharing stories with our friends and family over dinner than sharing stories in a work situation. So let's work through a few of those now. And the first is, it's got to be purposeful. So you have to have a reason for sharing your stories. You don't want to share stories in a business setting and people walk away thinking, what was that about? So you've got to be really, really clear on what your message is when you're sharing stories. The second consideration when you're sharing stories in business is that it needs to be relatable. So your story needs to be really relatable. What I find is the more day-to-day stories you are, the more relatable they will be. So stories about when you're a kid. You know when you share stories about mistakes you've made, we can all relate to that because we've all made mistakes. Stories about when you didn't get it right and you learned something from that, again, they're the relatable ones because we can all relate to that. This is where I think, the stories of winning an Olympic medal or, climbing Mount Everest, really hard to relate to. So the more day-to-day your stories are, the more relatable. The other thing in business is they've got to be succinct. So your stories have to be really succinct. My rule of thumb is that your story should be about 1 to 2 minutes long. Any longer than that, people will start thinking, get to the point. Believe me, it doesn't matter how exciting you think your story is. In a work situation, people will be thinking, if not saying, get to the point. And you want to be finished your story well before that's the case. So be really succinct, 1 to 2 minutes. Your stories also need to be, congruent. So your stories need to be congruent. And so what I mean by that is that if you're sharing a story about the importance of respect, you really need to live and breathe respect. So you can't share stories about one thing, but your actions do something different. So make sure they're congruent. They also, before we get to that, as part of congruence, they also need to be authentic. So make sure your stories are authentic. the entire time. I often say when you go see a comedian, the transaction you enter into is that I will pay you money and you make me laugh. And you know half the time that the stories are not true. But in business, the transaction we enter into is that your stories will be relatable. So absolutely make sure they are, relatable, congruent, and authentic. So they've got to be true. They've got to be true. The other thing I want to talk to you about is the curse of knowledge. So this concept came from a woman who in 1990 did some research at Stanford University, and she split people into two groups, one with the tappers, one with the listeners. And what she got the tappers to do was to just tap out really well-known songs. So they just had to tap it out on a table, a well-known song, and the listener had to guess it. And they asked the tappers what they thought their success rate would be. And they said 50%. We think 50% of the time people will guess the song. The actual figure was 2.5%. And I think it goes to show that when we go out and communicate something, we actually overestimate our ability that it's got through. There's a great quote from George Bernard Shaw, and he says the single biggest problem with communication is the illusion that it's taken place. I love that quote, the illusion that it's taken place. And we've all experienced this where people go, you never told me that. And you're thinking you were at the meeting last week when we discussed it. Or, you know, even in a personal level, when your partner says, we have not had this conversation before. And you go, we've had it 3 times. So just be mindful of the curse of knowledge. There's a couple of ways to dodge the curse of knowledge. The first is, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but just reduce the amount of jargon and acronyms you use. So I'm also the founder of Jargon Free Fridays because I really think the overuse of jargon and the overuse of acronyms really impacts on our ability to communicate properly. And we're saying acronyms and assuming people know what they mean, but a lot of the times they don't. So if I say SME, for example, half of you will think of subject matter expert and half of you will think of small to medium enterprise. So you've really got to be mindful of the jargon and acronyms you use. And of course, the other way to dodge the curse of knowledge is to use a story. So just the example I gave, you know, with Rosemary using the copperhead snake story to explain what a risk manager does. So she dodged that curse of knowledge where everything else had failed. She managed to communicate that through a story. Now, one other thing I want to just briefly touch on before I take you through the structure of a story is this is Aristotle. So Aristotle said that you needed 3 things when you're trying to influence people. You need logos, ethos, and pathos. Now, logos is logic, so you absolutely need sound logic when you're trying to influence people. Ethos is personal credibility, and pathos is emotional connection. So you need logic, you need personal credibility, and you need emotional connection. Now, if I sort of said, where do we spend the most time? I think you'd be right in saying we spend the most time on logic. We try to influence people through logic. The reality is that logic is the least important. When we're trying to influence people, what's the most important is personal credibility and emotional connection. Now, I'm not saying you don't need logic. You absolutely do need logic, but stories can help you get that personal credibility and emotional connection. Now, a lot of the time, all you need is logic. So if someone's asking you for a project status update or the latest sales figures, clearly you just need logic. But if you're trying to influence people, then you need to tap into emotion and personal credibility. You need to use a story. So think of stories of how you can use them strategically. You know, when you want people to really understand and remember your message, when you're trying to influence people to do something, when you're trying to, get people to think about something and get engaged in. So, for example, rolling out company values. I don't believe you can roll out company values on logic. I think you need to do it through stories to create that emotional connection. If you're experiencing that curse of knowledge where you're going, why don't they get it? Why don't they get it? Don't throw more logic at the problem. Perhaps use a story and see if that helps you. So what I'm going to do quickly now is just take you the process of how you tell a story. So this is a framework I've developed over the last 15 years, and it will just help you avoid some of the really common mistakes that there is with storytelling. So let's get into that. First is you've got to be really clear on your message. So we said this, Really know what the message is. Don't try to have 2 or 3 different messages in there. Be really clear on your message. So if your message is around the value of respect, what does that mean to you? You know, is it about, if you say you're going to do something, do it? Is it about listening to people? Is it about not judging people too quickly? Be really clear on what that message is. You then do need to take into consideration your audience. So what are they thinking? Are they going to take the message, you know, positively or negative? So be really clear on who your audience is, and will your story relate to them? You need to find where you get your ideas from stories. One of the things I suggest is just, you know, when you've got a spare half an hour, sit down and from your earliest memories, just write out, you know, everything you can remember, just write it down. I had a client yesterday who was trying to come up with a story, and I told him this approach, and he said he sat with it all day, just thinking of all these different things that have happened in his life that he could potentially use from stories. Often we think we don't have any stories because we're just normal. Normal's good. Normal's good. People relate to normal. So just the normal day-to-day stories from your life can be the most powerful. So once you've got your story and you think, okay, this could work, where you start your story is the beginning. So time and place. The most effective way to start your story is with time and place. For example, when I was a kid, I grew up on a farm. How you don't want to start your story is with, let me tell you a story. So as humans, we're hardwired to listen to stories. So if you start with, when I was a kid, I grew up on a farm, your audience now know you're about to tell them a story. When you start your story with, let me tell you a story, they can switch off a bit. Can you just feel the difference in that beginning? The beginning should be really short. It literally should be one sentence and you've started your story. Then you get into the middle. Now, the middle is where everything happens. So you have to constantly question the detail. Is this bit of detail relevant to your message? If it is, leave it in. If it's not, leave it out. You could have a story that if you were sharing with your friends could go for 10 minutes. So you've obviously got to cut out a lot of detail, and being clear on what your message is will help you determine what detail you leave in and what detail you leave out. Use real words in your story. So what I mean by that is don't use jargon, don't use acronyms. Use real words that people can connect and engage with. So for example, a lot of us might use a safe word. You might be sharing a story and you might say, I was anxious. You know, what about saying something like, I was really scared? So can you see how really scared I can connect with a lot more than just saying I was anxious? So, you know, I often talk about, you know, if you're sharing a story about when you're an 8-year-old child and Santa didn't give you the bike you wanted for Christmas, don't describe that as my objectives were not met. You know, use real words as you would if you're an 8-year-old kid. Then we get to the end. So in the end, there's several parts to the end. The end is like the most important part of your story. It's sort of like landing the plane. Doesn't matter how smooth the flight is, the ending, the landing will make or break it. So the first bit is the bridge. So a simple end to your story, because you're sharing your personal story, is I'm sharing this with you because it reminds me of. So, you know, Rosemary's sharing her copperhead snake story, but then right at the end she'll go, I'm sharing this with you because it reminds me of the role we play in Risk. So that's the bridge. It takes the person from the personal to the work. Then we get to the link, where the link should be really inviting. So you don't want to end your story with, so the moral of the story is. You want to end it with, imagine what we could achieve, or wouldn't it be good if, or just think what we could imagine. So if you look at, and then finally, when you've finished your story, pause, just stop talking. So let me share the copperhead snake story with you again, now that you know that structure of beginning, middle, bridge, link, pause. So when I was a kid, I grew up on a farm. And growing up on a farm, there was all these dangers we needed to be aware of, but Mum would teach us what to do. So we knew what to do when we came across a spider in the timber heap. We knew about all the potential traps in the dam after heavy rain. And we knew what to do if we ever came across a snake in summer. And I remember this really hot day, Mum was yelling at me to get my bike from the front gate. So I ran down the path And then I just froze because in front of my bike was this massive copperhead snake. But I remembered everything Mum taught us to do. So I played statues and I slowly walked backwards until there was enough space between me and the snake, and I ran back to the house to tell Mum. And I'm sharing this with you because it reminds me of the role we play in risk. All I can do is give you the skills, knowledge, and advice. So when you come across your own copperhead snake, regardless of what that looks like, you will know what to do. So hopefully when I was sharing that story, you saw the very clear beginning when I was a kid, I grew up on the farm, the middle where all the information happened, and then the bridge, which was I'm sharing this with you because it reminds me of the role we play in risk. So you can see how that's the bridge. And then the link was really inviting. Imagine what we could achieve if. Wouldn't it be good if? Some other things going, I invite you to consider. So that's how you can share your story. Let me, we've only got a couple of minutes left. So I might just share one more example, which will hopefully help you see the structure of a story. So I was doing a work with a senior leader. One of the stories she wanted to communicate was a company value around doing the right thing. So their company value was doing the right thing. This is the story she shared. She said, in the 1960s, my dad was a professional swimmer. And he was really good. He was a professional swimmer. And at some point, he got so good that he actually was trying out to make the Australian swim team to see if he could make the Olympics. And on the day of his meet, he was apparently winning the race. And he got to the end to do the tumble turn, and he slightly misjudged and he missed the wall. Now, this was well before technology, so they didn't have sensors, and they did have judges at the end, but with all that splashing, he sort of knew that they wouldn't know if he missed the wall or not. And he had to make a split-second decision to say, does he go back and touch the wall, or does he just keep going? And he actually decided to go back and touch the wall. Now, he didn't recover from that. He lost the race. And Anne would go to his dad, do you ever regret going back and touching the wall? And he said, I've never regretted that. Because if I didn't go back and touch the wall, I would have to spend the rest of my life knowing I've done the wrong thing. And doing the right thing is doing the right thing all the time. And I'm sharing this with you because when I think of our value doing the right thing, I think of my dad. There will be moments at work where we are faced with our own go back and touch the wall moment. And I invite you to consider what my dad would do. So again, hopefully you saw the beginning, middle, bridge link in that. And hopefully through sharing that story, you're thinking if Anne was your manager, the messages she can get across with that. So the culture she is setting, the value she is getting across, what's important to her. And I think you can only get that through the story. You can't, if Anne had just said doing the right things about doing the right thing all the time, it wouldn't have its impact. So I'm going to leave you with that. On the screen, you can see these are my 5 published books. If storytelling is you really want to get better at that, I would suggest the blue one, Stories for Work, is a great investment. My latest book, Real Communication, the one bottom left, is also a good book around communicating more effectively. I spent a bit of time on jargon and acronyms and the consequence of that. So if you're only ever going to get 2 books, I would go for the 2 down the bottom there, Real Communication, Stories for Work. Unless you're going for a job interview, then storytelling for job interviews is good. That's all my social media. Connect with me on Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook. I would love to hear your stories and love to hear how you go, and good luck on your journey of storytelling.